When is it not? What role should police play in our society? What kinds of incentives do we want them to have? He's written papers on protests and the policing of protests. He's written about cities and urban politics. He's written about land use. He's written about structural injustice. Okay. You're probably getting a sense. Interesting guy. So, Jake, welcome. Thanks so much for talking to me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, full disclosure. I happen to actually, I like Jake. We're friends, so
So we're-
we've been to the to Joshua Tree together. And there's some slightly embarrassing staged photographs of us as groomsmen, like walking towards the camera.
They're
That
not embarrassing. We look cool.
they, all right, I'm going to adjust my credences on that then. Uh, but you probably won't see them posted online. Well, maybe sometime soon. But anyway, Jake, great to see you. Let me just start with maybe the obvious question, which is, how did you get interested in philosophy of policing?
Yeah, so I was a grad student when I first got interested in it. I mean, I was sort of like, as a kid, interested in politics, and so interested in policing a little bit. But at the time that I like wrote my first paper, I was interested in like professional ethics, and I had this theory of like the way that professional ethic applies to people like nurses and doctors. And then meanwhile, um, the Black Lives Matter movement had sort of just kind of spawned. And there were these like really dumb arguments about like blue lives matter, right? In response to the Black Lives Matter stuff. I don't know if you remember this, but I found this just like dumb and like offensively so. And it seemed like there was a really obvious way to take my sort of broad thinking about professional ethics and apply it to the police, in particular, to intervene in this debate about the Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter stuff. The basic idea is just that police have special moral obligations to avoid harming people, to avoid, killing people, being otherwise violent. And these like really kind of flat-footed Blue Lives Matter arguments just entirely overlooked that.
But can you tell me how you saw the Blue Lives Matter argument? I mean, I know I've seen the meme, but I want to know how you saw the argument.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, my read on this was I think you had a lot of people, mostly disingenuously, suggesting that, well, like two kinds of things, right? There's like one version of it, which is like, well, like, what about why are you focusing so much on police killings, right? What about like black on black crime? So there's like that sort of thing that fed into it, and then there is this other idea that, well, police are like under fire, we should support them, we should back the blue, or something like that. And so this is maybe another reason why you shouldn't be so upset about the fact that police are killing lots of people in the United States. Um, but again, right, this just sort of overlooks the special nature of the police role. Uh, so like that was my basic read on it. Like I said, I think it was mostly kind of disingenuous as a way to like take the wind out of the sails of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Right. Do you think that we've made some progress in our public debate about policing since then, or do you think we're still as benighted?
I think we've made some progress. I mean, one of the things that you'll see a lot of police scholars do is they'll go back to like reports from presidential commissions from like, I don't know, the 60s, or you'll look at complaints that people in New York City were making about the police in, like 1930 or whatever. And it really looks quite a bit like the kind of complaints that you see today. And so there's like a really pessimistic takeaway from this, which is that these problems are inherent to policing. Maybe you think that's like a reason to abolish them. Or even if they're not inherent, like we're just definitely not making any progress on them. And I think that's not the right read on this. I mean, I think that there are certain kind of moral risks associated with policing that are just durable. And so you're going to have like broadly similar kinds of complaints about the police. But that's consistent with the problems getting more tractable, or solving certain problems. So, like, one of my favorite examples is you can find this memoir from an immigrant to New York City who became a police officer. This is like, turn of the century. This guy's got like a real literary voice. It's really fun to read. It's called Behind the Green Lights. And in this, you get a bunch of these like really entertaining tales about his policing New York City. And one of the stories that he tells is there's this one guy who's like harassing another guy. So the other guy, the one being harassed, goes up to this police officer who wrote the memoir and says, "Hey, here's some cash. I'm going to beat the shit out of that guy if that's cool with you." And the officer says, "Yeah, this guy seems like a jerk." And so he accepts the money and he's like, "Go for it." And like policing is really bad in all sorts of ways, but I think it's really unlikely that you're going to get an officer bragging about this kind of abuse of the police office, right? I mean, surely you will find ICE agents saying all sorts of heinous stuff and being proud of it, but like we're talking about like normal people here, like police officers, not ICE agents. So like I take this to be some evidence that like we have made improvements in police culture and the ethics of policing, and there's obviously plenty of room for improvement.
So maybe there are, uh, as you put it, durable inherent problems, but that doesn't mean that they're not. You can't work on them.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, like police officers, like any other employee, they're sensitive to managerial directives and, you know, selection effects when it comes to hiring. Like there are a lot of kind of policy levers that you can pull on. They're not always easy, but there are a lot of things you can do to influence the way that policing happens.
So since we're talking about policing as a profession, I want to ask you what you see the profession as being. So, a common view is that the police are mainly there, or that their function is to enforce the law. I mean, they're called law enforcement. Do you think the common view is right? Do you have another view?
So I think I've got a lot of thoughts about police as a profession. So like one thing to say here is that we often think of professions, or at least this is how I usually encourage my students to think of professions, as social technologies that solve a principal agent problem. So it doesn't really matter like what the profession is. Like you go to them because they can do something that you can't do. And when you're trying to solve this principal agent problem, when you're trying to get the agent rather, to actually work effectively on behalf of the principal, you need ways to ensure that they're doing that, right? And because we don't always know like the best way to defend a legal case or something, we need the profession itself to supply a lot of these tools, right? So we need them to be doing accrediting. We need them to be basically like self-policing, right? They need to be like forming codes of ethics and punishing people for not adhering to them. So that's like kind of one half of what a profession is. And then in a bunch of cases, we think that the profession also has like distinct technical expertise and tools that they can use, right? So like an MRI machine or something like that. For police, right, the technologies have often been, various forms of weapons. So, the move from like the club to like the revolver to the 9 millimeter, service weapon we have today, and, tasers and mace and this sort of thing, right? Initially we had like bicycles, and like the police radio is a big deal, and like the police cruiser has taken this sort of thing over. So in my view, the police are basically halfway professionalized. They've got all the tools, right? People will often complain about the tools under the heading of militarization. We can complain about some of the tools they have, but like they do have some of them, right? Like they're collecting DNA evidence or databases, so on and so forth. But what you see, particularly in like the Blue Lives Matter shtick, and in like the Back the Blue stuff, or people will talk about like the blue wall of silence, is that there's very little in the way of the profession policing itself. Rather, they will rally around even bad actors, clearly bad actors who are under fire, either like, socially or from the legal system. And so with respect to police professionalization, I think they're like halfway there. They're not fully a profession because they basically do very, very little. I don't want to say nothing, but like kind of next to nothing about what I think of as like the social technology that's a response to the principal agent problem. You want officers critiquing bad policing rather than saying, well, you weren't there, you wouldn't understand, right?
I mean, this seems like a real common complaint, and often very substantiated. There's this paper by Ben Grunwald and co-authored about like the wandering officer, and how common it is for somebody who's got a string of complaints to just you know basically like wander from job to job, and rather than somebody putting their foot down and being like, no, you can't be a police officer anymore. So like what's going on here? If you have a view about this, why has it been so hard for departments to, or just the profession in general, to do some quality control?
I think there are a lot of reasons. So I think one of the reasons is a kind of cultural one. Like it's not a given that a group of people will come together to improve the quality of the services that they provide, right? You will have people just more yeah, more interested in predation or whatever. And so like I think this happens. Um, you have like really entrenched interests in a certain sense. So like not only does the police have a relatively powerful union, but they end up being like a pretty substantial voting block in city elections. And like we can complain about this, but this is also a way in which like the democratic process is just sort of like funneling in the views of the people, right? We often think the views are bad, and there's some systematicity here. Um, I also think that in addition to this kind of cultural stuff, there's just an institutional answer here. So people will often point out that policing in the United States is highly decentralized. So I think it's something like 14,000 or 18,000 police agencies in the United States. I don't know. I never remember the number off the top of my head.
18 is the last one I heard.
18. Yeah, that sounds about right. So, right, most of these are really small. You've got some big city police departments, so like the NYPD, the LAPD, Chicago PD, whatever, right? These are really large, professionalized departments with like pretty intense hierarchies and lots of specialization. But then in other places, you'll have a department that has like two people in it. So the town that I grew up in, Rhode Island, had no police department. I think it was unincorporated. I'm not sure actually now that I think of it, but like it was really small, only a few thousand people. We had one stoplight, and it could have been a stop sign. So like no need for a police department, right? The traffic was enforced by the occasional state police officer. So if you're driving around and you see a state police officer, you're like, oh, okay, there are no other police in the rest of West Greenwich, right? Nearby, there was Exeter. They had a police department, but I think there were like two people. And, you would be driving by where they stored the police car because I don't think there was an actual police station. And it's like, oh, yeah, the cruiser's parked there. So there are like no cops in the rest of the area, right? So we're talking about like really, really small departments in a lot of these cases. If you've only got a few people, there's very little in the way of specialization. There's no ability or need really. And so they're just not going to professionalize. They're going to be just like little kind of podunk operations where like the guy in charge can be something of a dictator if he wants, right? And so when you have an officer who gets fired from like the Chicago Police Department or like, I don't know, in my case, the Providence Police Department or Warwick Police Department or something, they leave one of these big police departments that's professionalized with opportunities for advancement and stuff like that. When they do something bad and they get booted, well, they can just go to one of the many surrounding agencies. And in a lot of cases, the training that you get in the bigger departments is better. This isn't always the case, but often it is. And so the smaller departments are sort of interested in hiring these people. I also have to imagine that in some cases, the small town police chief is like, back the blue. This officer who like shot this kid, well, we can't criticize him, right? And I actually, as a police chief, can sort of like reach out and give this person a lifeline and bring them into the department. I don't have no evidence that that's in fact happening, but it wouldn't surprise me. I think there are a bunch of reasons why like you get this wandering officer problem.
That's super interesting. I mean, I wonder if also there's something specific to the police that is contributing in their job that's contributing to this cultural issue. So, I mean, obviously, policing is dangerous. So it's not as dangerous as logging in terms of chances of being killed. If we call, a tree falling on you being killed rather than merely dying. Yeah, I mean, but it's actually very dangerous in
Yeah.
terms of like the chances of being killed by another human being are much higher as if you're an officer than if you're a professor or you know uh, or whatever. So, and I also think that a lot of police officers feel misunderstood by the public. Like they don't feel like critics appreciate how difficult it is to make choices under pressure. Now, I'm not saying that those are decisive points, but do you think that they play some role in explaining why the police have this kind of blue wall of silence? Or do you think that the blue wall is like wildly disproportionate to those concerns?
No, I mean, I think you're basically right. So you've got some pretty pronounced selection effects for being a police officer. It's not entirely surprising that it tends to skew male. Uh, Although there are other professions that are more dangerous, right? Logging is definitely one of them. There is something to be said about the fact that in that sort of case, the thing that you're worried about is like an accident happening. Likewise, if you're a commercial fisherman or something, another really dangerous job, right? But what you're not worried about in these cases is like someone literally attacking you. Now, the police, I think, routinely play up the threat of being attacked, but it is a kind of distinctive feature of the job. Arresting people is like rarely pleasant, right? People tend to not want to be arrested. And if you're going to arrest them, you're going to have to like get physical with them, right? There's just often no way around that. And so there are just certain features of the job that select for often like blue collar men. And so I think that this is one of the reasons why there are some of these sort of like pronounced cultural effects, right? There are like important selection effects. And the police, I think, largely because they haven't fully professionalized, get a lot of flack, and rightfully so, right? We don't usually expect perfection out of any profession that we work with, but what we expect is a kind of contrition when there are mistakes, right? We want you to show that like you are trying to improve, and we get basically none of this whatsoever from the police, right? They'll rarely like apologize for a mistake. If a SWAT team comes to your door and it turns out it's the wrong door, well, they're coming in anyway and they'll shoot your dog and then like they won't apologize, right? There are like a million cases of this. You can look to the like Radley Balco stuff to see it. So I think that like part of the lack of professionalization encourages a kind of lack of trust and a lot of criticism. And that combines with the fact that lots of people don't actually know the what it's like to police the kinds of decisions that they have to make. And so like it's easy for a police officer or like the group of officers to think that they're being unfairly criticized, right? And they sort of like turn in. I don't think this is distinctive to policing. I think that you'll see professors do this, particularly as like the Trump administration ramps up its critiques, right? There is a real feeling amongst a lot of academics that like don't say anything that's critical of academia. Like you can't do that right now. The circumstances are too dangerous. If you like sort of crank this up, you get the kind of phenomenon that you get in policing. I think
You
that's
know,
the
that's what I say about everybody writing about my papers. But other papers, that's when we show the world that we're able to criticize ourselves. Let's point the guns at the real enemy. So anyway, I really that all sounds very plausible to me, and I wonder though, what do you think? What do you think about the possibility that rather than trying to professionalize the profession completely, why not just change the profession to something else? So, I mean, why do you think, if you do think society needs police?
Yeah. Okay. This is a really good question, actually, and it goes back to the question you asked me a moment ago that I didn't really answer. But so, like, let me say something about this. Right? People will frequently distinguish the law enforcement function of a police department from like the order maintenance side. You can think about the difference between detectives and investigators and your typical patrol officers. They end up doing very different kinds of work. And we know because of federal law enforcement agencies that they don't have to be combined, right? Most federal law enforcement agencies are specialized. So you've got like the Capitol Police who are usually doing a kind of order maintenance patrol sort of deal. And then you've got, ICE. And they're out, doing investigations, right? Or like harassing brown people at Home Depot is actually what they're doing. Okay, so the patrol function of policing I take to be, borrowing a term from the police scholar David Thatcher, a residual role. So there are just lots of problems that will crop up in dense environments that you need someone to do something about. So at like, the turn of the century, before we had animal control, one of the main things that police officers in cities would do is they would shoot stray dogs. Because I don't know, I guess the stray dogs were a really serious problem, and like this is just what you did, right? Um, and this is the sort of thing that has largely gone away because now cities have like animal control departments, but occasionally you'll still get police being called. They're like it's common to call a police officer in Florida, I think if there's like an alligator on your property, right? Anyway, I've seen a bunch of videos of like Florida cops, like basically arresting alligators. Or like there's the
I
Capitol
feel like
Police.
that seems like an offensive stereotype against any Floridians that might be watching this, but that also seems real.
But there's a case of like the Capitol Police within the last few years having to respond to, I think it was like a coyote on the Capitol grounds. I maybe am misremembering the details, but anyway, just like, look, there's a coyote here. We've got to do something about it. There's an alligator in my driveway. We've got to do something about it, right? You need someone to sort of handle the problem. But this is true of a lot of things, right? So whenever we have public space, there will be people who are using that space in ways that have externalities that we need to manage, right? So you can specialize your kind of enforcement agencies in different ways. If your town is really small, there's just not a lot of room for specialization, right? If you've got like 4 people in the police department. But if you're thinking about the way that Los Angeles is policed, right? You've got like the LAPD, you'll see them on like the subway platform sometime, but you've also got like private security. The Metro agency is like revamping its own police department. There are these business improvement districts downtown that, they hire people to ride around on bikes and like colored polos and, break up fights or give people having a mental health crisis some resources. They pick up lots of trash, right? They like water the trees and that sort of deal. So there's, in my view, like no getting rid of the need to manage our public spaces in various ways. And that requires the activity of policing. And you have decisions about how you carry that activity out. The larger your city, right, probably the more specialized it's going to be. And so some people like the idea of unbundling the police. Let's take their separate tasks and give them to different agencies. And there's a sense in which that happens kind of naturally as a city grows, right? We can take it to a further extreme. In some cases, we probably want to, but like I think this kind of happens on its own. On the other hand, you've got like the detectives. These are the law enforcement people. And so some people have this view that like what the police do is enforce the law. And if you're thinking about detectives, that might be right. But if you're thinking about the patrol officers, they're not like literally just directly enforcing the law. Because like if you walk around a big city, you'll see people breaking a whole bunch of different laws all the time, right? And so they have to make these decisions about which laws they want to enforce, how they're going to enforce them. Are they going to tell you to move along? Are they going to make an arrest? Are they going to give you a ticket? Right? Whatever the decision is. Um, and so what that means, in my view, is that you need a different way of thinking about where the justification of police power comes from. Or put differently, if you think that police officers have special moral obligations and there are important reasons for them not to enforce particular laws in certain circumstances, well, then you're on the hook for like a theory of police discretion.
Why do you think police, or how do you see that theory? So one of the things I really liked about your book, which I reviewed for ethics before we were friends. So that was my impartial view of the book, was that it was a good ass book. But something I really enjoyed about the book was this emphasis on discretion. And, I think your kind of background is coming at this from not policing in particular, but like professions and bureaucracies more generally, right? Helped you kind of bring this out. And it really changed the way I see the issue. So, I mean, how do you see police discretion? Like, why is it necessary and what does it do?
So I distinguish between two kinds of discretion that characterize policing. So we have see if I can remember them. What do I think? I'll have to look at my book. Uh, uh, Priority discretion, and what's the other kind of discretion? Do you remember?
Interpretation,
Interpretive.
interpretive discretion.
Oh my god. Okay, so um, police have different kinds of laws to enforce, right? So the speed limit, 65 miles an hour. If you're going 66 miles an hour, you violated the law, right? But then there are vague laws. So think about a law against loitering, which still exists in some jurisdictions. Uh, well, you have to figure out what counts as loitering, right? I'm hanging out in an area with no purpose. Like, technically, that's kind of loitering, but at the same time, it seems like anytime someone's standing around on the sidewalk, they're doing it for some purpose. They're like, appreciating the graffiti that just went up on this building, or they're, just engaging in people watching or whatever it is, right? And so there's a question here about what it is to loiter or what it is to engage in disorderly conduct. If we have vague laws, then police officers, much like judges, need to interpret the statute. And so they're making a decision about what counts as loitering. Now, you might think this looks like legislative power rather than executive, and you might think that's something to worry about. On the other hand, we could have really specific laws. So we could say the interpretive discretion is really bad. We need to get rid of that. What we're going to do is just make the legal code much more specific to try to eliminate the interpretation. Well, when you do that, you end up with something like the traffic code, right? You basically cannot drive your car without breaking the law because the traffic code is extremely specific. Police know this. And so if they want to stop you, right, they just have to wait until you drive. And then almost they're guaranteed to find something that they can pull you over for, right?
And the Supreme Court has decided that this is totally allowed. They can just follow
Really?
you.
Yeah, that's right. Lawful but awful, right? We might call it. So what we don't see, though, are police officers pulling people over all the time. They just don't have the resources to do that. They have to focus their efforts on other things. Even traffic officers are routinely not pulling people over for, only speeding a little bit or having a tail light out, right? So the California Highway Patrol mostly just patrols the highway, right? It's not like they have to worry about, sex workers or drug dealers or this sort of thing, right? All they do is traffic, and still they're prioritizing their resources and saying there's a whole bunch of traffic enforcement that's just not worth it, right? So the police are always torn between these two sides of the spectrum. In some cases, they'll have to engage in interpretation. In other cases, they'll have to engage in prioritization. And there's really no way of getting the kind of police decision making out of the mix. Yeah.
That's great. We've got a question that I think I wonder. This is from Nathaniel Joseph. I'll just go ahead and read it out. So, out of curiosity, was there any connection with Joseph Heath's book, The Machinery of Government? The theory of police discretion sounds similar to his idea around professional civil service having cost benefit analysis as a liberal standard.
Yeah, so absolutely. I'm really influenced by Heath. I think Heath's great. He does really good work. I think the machinery of government is really, really good. I read that while I was in the process of basically finishing up Just Policing. And he's got this section in the book where he says something about like executive power, like beyond discretion. And I was like, you know what? This is actually like a really powerful way to put it, right? We worry about bureaucratic discretion where people are sort of like kind of nibbling around the edges, I guess, of the decisions that the legislature makes. And he's like, look, this is not the right way to think about it. They just have full blown political power. Like open decision making they have is pretty broad, right? And so given that, framing it in terms of discretion is maybe not particularly useful, right? So like I think he's right about that. I buy that argument. The reason I retained the idea of discretion is because in the context of policing, what I wanted to emphasize is the kind of inherent push and pull between priority and interpretive discretion. Um, but yeah, like much like Heath, I think that what is really important is that we have a normative, like a politically normative account of how the bureaucrats should exercise their power. I haven't fully thought about how to like import the cost benefit analysis stuff to policing. In certain cases, right, we can think about like, are we going to put in a bike lane or are we going to put in a park? And we can think about whether we maximize preference satisfaction, in the one case versus the other. And there's some kind of liberal cost benefit analysis happening here. I don't really know how to think about this in the context of policing. There's like a way of making the police more efficient, right? Getting more bang for your buck, which often seems not good. But yeah, like there's the projects I think are pretty congenial. We both think that there is this problem of bureaucrats having lots of political power, and then we need to think about what it is that constrains that. And it can't be fix the criminal code or fix the regulatory statutes or whatever, because we can just go back to that principal agent problem, right? There are just questions about how police, whether they're detectives or patrol or whether they work for the EPA or whatever, are exercising their power.
Yeah, this is, I think, such a great dilemma that you pose. If the law is too vague, the police have to use their judgment to interpret it. if it's too precise, everything's going to be illegal, and that they have to use their discretion in choosing whether to enforce it, like whether to prioritize, this or that infringement of the law. Um, but I want to now turn to kind of the other really big idea in your book. At least, in my view, maybe you've got a different sort of Hall of Fame from your book, but legitimacy risks. So you have this framework. It's not cost benefit analysis, but it's a kind of like, I think of it as like a checklist for 4 serious ways in which a police policy might become illegitimate. It might lead officers to do morally indefensible things. So uh, I want to just invite you to tell us about the 4 legitimacy risks, and then I have a couple of ideas for things to ask about them specifically.
Sure. So, in a lot of cases, I think our discussions about policing and whether it's permissible or legitimate or however we want to think about it often turn on kind of substantive questions about their goal. So you'll routinely see like liberal commentators say things like people have a right to, use drugs, and therefore like the war on drugs is impermissible, right? And it's in large part because the thing that they're aiming at, people will take to be like an illegitimate aim of the state. One of the things that I wanted to be able to do was to give us some tools for thinking about normative evaluation of policing that doesn't rest directly on these substantive evaluations. In part because I'm kind of a committed liberal at this point, and I just think that like one of the really important things that we have to do in political philosophy is come up with like a normative theory of how to accommodate and handle our disagreements. So like it's really not that interesting for me to say like I've got the correct view of morality, and now what politics is just like a way of implementing that. Like that does not actually seem like the right way to think about what we're doing when we do political philosophy.
Yeah,
Okay. So that
and
means
just to clarify, so when you say liberal, you mean classical liberal?
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, but we're out of the academic sphere now. Like liberal means something different.
Yeah, yeah, no, you're right. I'm sorry. I think I maybe was misled by like the title of your podcast or your Substack, right? Where like we're really academic here, but no, right, we're not. Okay, so yes,
No, sorry.
yeah, yeah, no, good.
My
No,
dad's here, so I want to make sure he knows. Anyway, I'm just kidding.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. So
So
pardon the
right,
interruption.
yeah, like by liberal, there's like a kind of commitment to like the equality of people and like uh, a preference for like tolerance and accommodation of diversity. These are like the things that I have in mind.
Like John Stuart Mill, not necessarily Rachel Maddow.
Absolutely, John Stuart Mill. Definitely not Rachel Maddow. Yeah, definitely not. Okay, so let's see. I forgot my 2 kinds of discretion. We'll see if I can get all 4 of my legitimacy here. So, roughly, what I think is that there are kind of abstract characteristics of certain kinds of policing that are more likely to be illegitimate than others. So, one of the distinctions I draw is between proactive and reactive policing. So, if a police officer, sees A attacking B, well, they can intervene. And this looks quite a bit like if I intervene when I see A wrongly attacking B, right? The risk that the officer is doing something illegitimate here is not particularly pronounced. But if the officer is engaged in proactive work, right, if they're like trying to set up a sting, right? They're like, I know that there have been some fights around here, and you're really wimpy and puny, and I'm going to make you walk around this area, and I'm going to tell you, and if you get attacked, right? Like in a case like that, more likely to be illegitimate. It's not that stings are always illegitimate, but it seems like when police are proactive in their enforcement, this increases the risk to legitimacy. Another thing to think about is the amount of burden that different police activities have. So, if a police officer arrests you, it's not pleasant, handcuffs hurt, you get stuffed in the back of the cruiser, right? Jail's no fun. The burritos are really crappy, at least in California, right? You just get crappy frozen burritos. But no one wants this, right? The burden's really high. I'm sort of being glib here, right? The real costs are you might not have, you might struggle to get a job. Maybe you lose custody of your kids because you're in jail for a week and no one else is there to take care of them, right? Okay, so this is intuitive. The burden of an arrest is quite high.
Yeah, I got to shout out the classic, the classic book on how brutal it is to be arrested for misdemeanors, and just go even if you ultimately are exonerated. uh, then you just having to be detained and so on can really you can lose your job, family can fall apart, and so on. And Feely's book is a study of New Haven.
Yeah, yeah.
You cite it, but I happen to have it, so I wanted to shout it out. All right,
eh,
so we got two down: proactivity and burdens.
Okay. So, yeah, okay. We've got proactivity, we've got burdens. Another thing to think about is the democratic authorization of a particular statute. So, there are certain things that are kind of like uniformly agreed upon, right? We might have disagreements about how to engage in traffic policing. Maybe we don't want the police to do it, we want like a civil agency to do it. But basically, everyone's going to agree that like you can't, set up your vending stand on a lane of the highway, right? You can't block traffic. That's sort of not the point. So this kind of traffic enforcement is, I don't know, maybe it's not uniformly agreed upon, but has really strong democratic authorization. There are other kinds of policing that have low democratic authorization. So the classic examples are anything vice related. So there's a certain group of people who think that sex work is fine and permissible. And if we legalized it, it would be a lot less bad for the people involved. Likewise, for various kinds of, narcotics. Um, in these kinds of cases, you've got lots of disagreement. And so, if an officer were to proactively enforce a law against, say, the possession of heroin or something, they are doing like the risky thing, the proactive thing, in contexts where lots of the people who are subjected to the policing and lots of people who aren't think that they ought not to be doing that, right? And look, we don't have a perfect democracy. We know that there are problems of representation of various views, particularly when there's like the risk of marginalization. And if you come out and say, look, I think that it's fine for people to do drugs, right? You are like less likely to be taken seriously. Okay, so, again, there's some systematicity here. So the low authorization of lots of vice enforcement increases the risk. And these risks combine, right? Again, so if you think about the drug war, you've got high burden, low authorization, proactive policing, right? This looks pretty bad. And then, if I remember correctly, what's the fourth one? Lenience, is that right? No, what's
Think of the charts, the distribution.
the distribution? I can't remember my own view. This is terrible.
It's okay. This is Jake Monaghan's extended mind being interviewed here. Yeah.
I appreciate the help. So yeah, the distribution matters as well, right? In a lot of cases, the costs and the burdens of policing fall disproportionately on certain groups rather than others. And these groups often are further marginalized, right, as a result of their interaction with the criminal legal system. And so this sort of feeds back into these concerns that I was raising about the democratic authorization, right? So, if it turns out that like you have high burden activity, but you're sort of spreading that burden out across everyone sort of uniformly, we might just think that this is worth it, right? So like when you go into a sports stadium, you want to watch a game, well, they've got to make sure you're not like bringing in, weapons or things that you could throw on the field. Now everyone is subjected to this relatively high burden, right? Like it's not like being arrested, but also I don't like people going through my pockets and that sort of deal, right? Uh, if we only made a certain group go through the metal detectors on their way into the stadium, this would be much less likely to be legitimate, right? So that's one way in which they interact.
Yeah, that's great. I I want to ask you one kind of objection-ish question about the legitimacy risks. Which, just to recap, it's proactive, burden, how the burden's distributed, and then democratic authorization. Uh, and the question I have is, well, do you worry that officers might be like taking the law into their own hands if, you know, they are the ones who get to decide what's democratically authorized? So, just to put a concrete example on the table, um, one from the book. So in Burlington, Vermont, the police are thinking about um, uh, whether to enforce certain drug laws, and they think there's actually not much support among the people for this particular law, and I don't think it's doing anyone any good. So we're going to deprioritize these drug laws relative to, what in the wire would be called real policing, like more serious crimes and patrolling and so on. So, but
Yep.
but
Well,
someone who's critical.
McNulty comes up on a drug corner and they drop the drugs, and he's like, "I'm murder police. I don't care about that, but I hate Rick. You're gonna pick that shit up when I leave."
Yeah, no, I assign. I think I've told you this that for my philosophy, politics, economics capstone course, like the senior seminar, we watched The Wire season 3, just like cover to cover.
Yeah, it's great.
It's like I think it's genuinely the best text I've ever assigned in a class. Um, maybe with a few exceptions like Plato. But anyway, I,
It's up there.
it's up there. But point being,
Yeah.
do you worry about the like taking the law into their own hands aspect?
So I definitely do. There's a kind of like cheap move to make here, which is if you buy what I've said about the enforcement dilemma, then this just equally characterizes basically all policing and probably not just policing, right? We can go to Heath and find that this is going to be the case across like most kinds of regulation, right? But
Right.
I think that there's like a less, there's like a, I don't know, there's a more ambitious response here. And that involves pointing out that in a lot of the cases, what I'm interested in is a justification of discretionary non enforcement. So, like, to go back to the kind of research trajectory here a little bit, like early on, I was suggesting that police officers have really strong reasons not to engage in certain kinds of enforcement activity because it will be harmful, it will be unjust, or whatever, right? And the response is, well, if you think that police officers should not enforce the law, because you claim that it's unjust, like you need an account of discretion, justified and unjustified discretion. And what I am particularly interested in doing is giving you an account of how it could be that an officer declining to enforce the law is actually legitimate and not merely like legitimate with respect to these kind of like substantive liberal principles, but in fact with respect to a kind of democratic concern for responsiveness, right? So when the police officer ignores the sex worker rather than making an arrest, I think that we can interpret this as a kind of responsive, pro democracy like way of exercising discretion. In this case, the discretion is non enforcement. And so the taking the law into their own hands thing is more troubling to me when we're thinking about police officers who are forcing informants to engage in otherwise illegal activity, right? Than in the kinds of cases I'm interested in where I'm saying the police officer didn't arrest that person who's clearly smoking a crack pipe, like you see this on the streets of LA all the time. Uh, but this isn't an affront to the democracy, right?
Yeah.
That's roughly well
Uh,
one of the ways that I want to talk about it.
that's great. I mean, I like that this shows there's a deep connection between the enforcement dilemma, which says, you know, to enforce the law, you have to use some discretion. And then the legitimacy risks, which says, well, look, if there's some discretion, what's going to guide it? And part of what you say should guide it is democratic authorization. So rather than just using your own private judgment, uh, what you want a professional ethic to incline people to do is to think about what the people want, what the people being policed want, because ultimately, what you hope is that the police are somehow uh, expressing the will of the people rather than being arbitrary powers
Yeah,
that can just impose their own will
yeah,
on.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Um,
So you'll get officers, like if you go to the police ethnographies, you'll see ways of thinking that kind of match this pattern. So you're not going to see anyone thinking in terms of legitimacy risk profiles, right? But you will see officers thinking in terms of whether the costs of a particular enforcement decision are actually worth it, right?
right.
Um, like you'll hear officers say things like, I could arrest that person, but like that really wouldn't be worth it. They'll spend the night in jail, like their bike will be confiscated. It's not worth it, right? I've got other things to do, even if the other thing to do is like sit in my police cruiser and scroll my phone, right? It's not worth it in that respect. You'll also hear, and I think that's the thing that often makes some academics uncomfortable. But police officers use asshole as a technical term. So, like, in through the decades and across cities, right? You'll see people saying things like, "We could arrest that person, but I told them to be a little bit more discreet, or I told them to move along, and they complied, and so I'm not going to actually arrest them." Right? The law is really for the assholes. Now, there are some kind of concerns, like I would like to see officers thinking in terms of legitimacy risk profiles rather than like some inchoate notion of an asshole. But like there is something here, right? Like in the urban context, the asshole is someone who totally ignores the fact that their actions have externalities, right? And if you think that like one of the things that police do is sort of manage the way that we interact in dense places, Like this is just sort of like part of the job, right?
Yeah. And there's the classic, is it Von Manen?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The classic policing paper called The Assel, sort of about this.
Yeah. So this isn't a reproduced in this anthology, which just has like the best cover ever.
That's amazing. Um, I gotta okay, man. I think we got all the essentials. It's time we can talk about whatever now. Um, I want to
Say one more thing then
please.
about just policing. So just to kind of like finish it up. So like the way that I think
Mhm.
like yeah, you've got the enforcement dilemma issue informed by the legitimacy risk profiles. But there are further democratic tools, controls, like tools of democratic control. And that has to do with the way that we structure our police agencies. So I think maybe one of the more speculative and kind of weird ideas in the book is that in many cases, we should separate out our law enforcement from order maintenance functions of policing. And one of the reasons you want to do this is because if you think about your typical police department, right? Imagine that you start out as like a rookie LAPD officer. You're just doing patrol. But look, like no one really loves doing patrol. You want to get promoted just like any other kind of entry level worker. And the way that you do that is like you try to get hired onto a specialized task force or you try to get hired into the investigative side of the department. Now, this means that you've got a lot of patrol officers going around exercising their discretion in ways where they're not trying to be good order maintenance patrol officers. They're trying to like pull off busts, right? They're trying to like find drugs, they're trying to find illegal guns, whatever it is. And so they start like fishing, right? Well, instead of pulling you over because you've just egregiously, ran a red light or something, I'm going to pull this other car over because they fit the description or like my mental model of what someone who's carrying drugs is likely, to look like. So I think that if you separate out these two functions, you get a handle on the selection effects. So you're only going to get people going into patrol departments who want to do that. And we see this in certain kinds of police agencies. So the people who police the beaches here in California started off as lifeguards. And as far as I know, there's no opportunity for them to be promoted onto like the narcotic task force or onto like the homicide squad or something like that. And so you're only going to have people going into that who are okay with doing that. And they're going to prioritize the things that make that kind of policing effective. You
It's,
better control things like the awards or the commendations and the training, right? If you've got things more specialized. So I think that like an important kind of democratic control over the police comes from controlling the structure uh, of the police agencies.
totally. It reminds me a lot of like Smith and Wealth of Nations, where he's talking about like these misaligned incentives that leaders have,
Yeah.
and you get no credit for just making the tolls work,
Yeah.
or the roads nice. You get credit for stuff that looks very impressive. In this case, the dope on the table, rather than like the hundreds of small but good professional contacts.
Yeah.
And there's a similar problem, I think, in universities. I'm told I'm not allowed to critique universities at the moment, but uh, like I think it's very common, and I don't blame the individuals for this, but like if you're a dean or some kind of leader, to keep going up, you have to make some kind of splash,
Yeah.
and so it's very common to rather than ask like, what's actually working and what should I leave in place? Like, the incentive is to say I have redone everything. I have done a new curriculum, even if the new curriculum is no better than the old,
Yeah.
um, and so on. Anyway, great. I feel like we covered some of the main things from the book. Um, I also wanted to shout out because you mentioned informants. Someone that we both know and like, Luke Hunt, has done some super interesting stuff on this. Former FBI. Like the FBI to philosophy pipeline must be incredibly small, but he did he did take it, and we had a workshop at UNC. What last year?
Yeah. I think so.
Yeah, last spring or sorry, spring 2024, and it was Luke, you, Lauren Lyons, and Renee Jorgensen, and it was so fascinating to hear Luke talk about his like how like repelled he was by those like dishonest practices that were routine
Yeah.
in policing. Um, and also it was very interesting to hear that some of the tensions between Lauren, who's written, I think, what we both think is one of the maybe the best defense of unbundling slash defunding
Yeah,
the police. I think it's like really the clearest defense of that I've ever seen,
definitely.
and also just like yeah, hearing Luke's also like living in Alabama, and the perspective of somebody who knows how like people in Alabama, like police in Alabama, feel about policing. I, I just really feel like there's a lot of room for discussion, and even though politically, I think less progress has been made on the issue than I would like.
Yeah.
I feel like the our thinking about policing and the kind of scholarly literature, the empirical literature, the philosophical debate are really actually in a good place.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think that there are more and more people working on it. I think that like the quality of the work in the area is definitely getting better. So like, yeah, I mean, well, we don't have to talk about Vitalik,
I don't know.
or we can. We can.
No, no, yeah, no. It's
Or Lions instead of Vitalik. I'll say that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I think the lion. I prefer the lions. I think I don't disagree with everything in the Vitalik book. Like I think there's some very interesting points.
Yeah, yeah, I do too. I mean, I actually think that you could pretty easily revise the Vitali book into a liberal reformist treatise rather than an abolitionist one. So if you just get rid of the kind of like intro and conclusion that frames this as an abolitionist project, what you'll find is that he's almost always critiquing practices that the liberals have also been critiquing, right? Like liberals don't like cops in schools for the most part. Liberals, there's like a literal cottage, it's not literal, there's a cottage industry, a figurative cottage industry of like liberal critiques of the war on drugs, you know? And so yeah, like you could totally, if you wanted, with not a whole lot of effort, I think, rewrite the bulk of what Vitali argues if you keep the good stuff, and you'll end up with a liberal reformist treatise.
What's funny is that I think from your perspective, that's like a very generous thing to say to Vitali. But I think from his perspective, it's like the most insulting thing you could ever have said about his body of work.
Yeah, I mean, Vitali like really, really hates liberals, and it's like it's right there in the book. You know, he describes the idea that police reduce crime as a liberal fantasy. You know, while citing outdated research, while misinterpreting outdated research. You know, yeah,
Yeah.
uh,
I thought
not-
your book did a great job sort of pushing back on his use of the policing research. And I tried to talk a bit about the updated parts of the book in my review, in particular the one posted on Substack,
yeah.
which has some, I think, statistical uh, goofs. But something that's kind of interesting about the intro to the book. So maybe I kind of want to ask you about this actually. Uh, so like where's he coming from? He says he thinks that police are being brought in to clean up the problems created by capitalism. And the examples are kind of, I think, poignant. So, for example, if there's homelessness, uh, in California or what have you, rather than finding housing, the police are called to disperse the homeless people. Um, and for Vitali, I think this is like a model for how the police function in the system. So the system creates some people that lose out or get oppressed or are materially just like deprived, the poor, or they don't have houses and so on. Uh, and then the police come in and sweep them away so that we don't have to deal with them or look at them. And, my sense is that he came to this from thinking about those issues like homelessness first. That at least that's my impression from the intro. What do you think about that kind of? I think of that as like a left critique of the police that's trying to get into something really deep. Like the police are really there just to clean up other problems that are caused by deeper flaws in the system. So if we just fix those flaws in the system, the root causes of crime and root causes of these problems,
Yeah.
then we wouldn't have to be calling in the police.
So that's my read. So like I interpret Vitali as making two kinds of arguments. There's the inefficacy argument, which is just to say like the police don't do anything at all. This is his read of the David Bailey book, the like 1990s kind of state of the art interpretation of the literature. If you think that they just like don't do anything at all, well, everyone agrees that they have costs and burdens associated with them. And so, like, look, if we're not getting anything for the cost, just get rid of them, right? Um, but there's another argument, which I think of as like an inefficiency argument, which is kind of a root causes argument. So there are root causes of these problems, and you could, if you wanted, create policy to fix the root causes. Instead, we just sort of put a band aid on it, and the band aid is like the police. Now, it's definitely the case that there are certain problems that are induced by the legal system and that I think should make the police take a kind of light touch. So, one of the examples in just policing that I give is this little stretch of highway that goes through Delaware Park in Buffalo, New York. Someone fell asleep at the wheel, lost control of the car. The car like careened into a park and like hit a woman with the stroller. And it was this like really terrible thing. And so what the city did was they lowered the speed limit to I think like 30 miles an hour or something. Now, in a case like this, you've got a road that's designed as a highway with an artificially depressed speed limit, and it turns out it's like kind of next to impossible to actually do 35 miles an hour on like a highway with the like wide, vision and like the sweeping turns and that sort of thing. And so if a police officer kind of like set up a speed trap on that road and nabbed people for doing 45 or something, like that would be really bad, partly because the violation is induced by the state. So I think that this is a really important thing that we have to take really seriously. And I think it applies to our thinking about homelessness. So because of like NIMBY council members in Los Angeles, we don't build a lot of housing. And then for various other reasons, Los Angeles has a pretty pronounced homeless problem. And it would be, I think, kind of perverse to say, like, we're not going to let people build homes and that's going to result in your being homeless. And then we're going to, like, pretty brutally arrest you and throw you in jail as a result of this. So instead, I think that cities have to take an accommodating stance, right? But to the more general arguments, we just disagree about, I think, what the root causes are. So it just doesn't seem like at all plausible to me to think that most of what we want the police to do is a response to a problem caused by capitalism or something that we could actually like uproot and get rid of. So if you think about like one of the main things that patrol officers do, they're dealing with the fact that, as Brandon Del Pozo likes to say, we extend metaphysically into space. There's just friction, right? There are nuisances that arise in cities, and this is just a result of density. Doesn't really matter what kind of social economic system you have. When people come together in dense environments, there are going to be problems of externalities. We're going to need a lot of rules. Where can you park your car? How late into the night can you listen to your music and at what volume? Like, what can you put in the trash? How much water and at what price can you take out of the water system, right? So on and so forth. This has got nothing whatsoever to do with capitalism. You can imagine like an anarcho-syndicalist community in which we have like small groups of a few dozen people, and maybe we don't have these issues, but like that's a weird way of blaming capitalism, right? This is just a result of density. If you think about property crimes, in certain cases, it's just easier for me to satisfy the preferences I have if I take something that you've got rather than if I put in the effort to get it myself, right? And the police abolitionists themselves know this well because they're keen to point out that there's lots of white collar crime, there's lots of wage theft. The police don't do anything about this, right? So it's not like as soon as you become wealthy, your incentive to property crime goes away. So further, it's not as if we achieve the socialist revolution, everyone's materially equal, and property crime goes away. There's no reason to think that that's going to be the case, right? Then you think about things like violent crime. Well, in some cases, it's motivated by like ideological differences, right? Again, there's no uprooting that. This is just a fundamental fact about the world that we live in. In other cases, we've got like kind of cognitive flaws that follow up some of our like nuisance disputes. So in a lot of cases, like gun violence is occasioned by an argument. And if you listen to the behavioral economists, they'll say, well, we're thinking fast rather than thinking slow in these cases, and we're catastrophizing, and we're making all these sort of predictable mistakes that the behavioral economists will tell you all about. And that's what produces violence, right? Gun violence, knife violence, whatever. again, like it just does not at all seem to me like achieving the socialist revolution is going to solve this kind of problem. There are societies that are much less violent than the United States, right? We have a particularly violent society. And so it's not as if like we can't make headway on these problems, but I see no reason whatsoever to think that we can uproot these problems such that we no longer need like active law enforcement. Uh,
Yeah. And
that's is wrong, right? And it's also worth pointing out that like I don't know for whatever this is worth, but like uh people in like 50 years ago in the Soviet Union would make these kind of arguments about capitalism causing crime, but they also were like really explicit in thinking that that doesn't mean we need to get rid of the police, right? We still need an active law enforcement arm. So there's at least some disagreement amongst the political left about whether getting rid of capitalism will actually uproot the problem such that you can abolish the police.
yeah, I mean, it's not like China has no professional law enforcement, to give one other example, or Cuba.
We have police departments in New York City. I don't know if you saw this headline a little while back, but like, yeah, there are reports that like there is some self-policing happening within the self-policing, I don't know, within the Chinese community in New York with these like unofficial Chinese police stations.
Yeah, no, it was a pretty remarkable. Yeah, it seems to my sense is that there was an entire floor of a building that was allegedly being used as a police department for a foreign government
Yeah.
in New York City, but allegedly all the physical evidence was spoliated. So there was a confession, but we don't really know the full extent of it. I mean it's pretty nuts. Like law enforcement is definitely internet. I mean, obviously the U.S. has a certain amount of international pushing, but Canada and India have had very serious law enforcement disputes with the Sikh nationalism kind of tension with India, leading to like killings on Canadian soil.
Yeah.
But anyway, we could talk about the international stuff all day. But I wanted to follow up on something you said. So about the root causes. I, I think you're totally right that rich people crime too. Uh, but it does seem to me that, and I think some of this research for sure. Kevin Schneppel and Jens Ludwig had this fantastic meta analysis a little while ago that I read in the National Bureau of Economic Research working paper series um, about like what actually stops violent crime. And they found that uh, in many, many, many studies, only three showed that kind of like economic interventions had any effect, any positive effect on like reducing violent crime rates. And there were sort of exceptions that proved the rule. So one was, for example, a youth jobs program. And it seems pretty clear that it only stopped violent crime because if you're like playing volleyball over the summer or whatever, a grown up is watching you. So you're just doing something rather than having chances to cry. So money didn't help.
Yeah.
Economic opportunities per se didn't help. Uh, but they actually did have a noticeable effect on property crime. So their finding was that a lot of property crime is opportunistic. If I had more money, I wouldn't steal a TV and sell it. But not all property crime, but at least a significant amount. But violent crime, therefore, is like basically not at all opportunistic. And they hedge a little bit, but they say you can kind of divide it into crimes of, strategic, goal seeking versus crimes of passion.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, do you think that affects how we should think about policing? Because like maybe we can do something about property crime that's not policing and just cranking up the enforcement severity and so on. But for violent crime, it does seem to me like disputes getting out of hand is much more of a driver. And, does that mean that we need the police to resolve disputes? Maybe there's some other mechanisms we could be using to resolve disputes. Yeah, like what do you think about violent crime in light of some of this research?
Yeah. So my read on this is that this kind of debate is largely inflected through a slightly older debate about whether rational choice theory is a good macro theory of crime. So it's like the criminologists tend to not like the rational choice theory, right? So if you ask an economist, their macro theory of choice, they'll tell you something about like rational choice theory, unless they're a behavioral economist, right? And then it'll be a little bit different. But like the criminologists like the routine activities theory, or at least it was pretty popular for a while. And so the thought here is like, in order to have a crime, you need a target, an offender, and a lack of a guardian. And you can eliminate crime by changing any one of these. You can add a guardian. And so that's what the youth jobs program does, right? You can remove an offender in a certain sense. That's what the youth job program is going to do. And you can remove a target. So like one way to like remove the target is to like get rid of all our wealth, and then there will be no property crime anymore, right? Probably don't want to do that. And so maybe the like add a guardian, remove the offender is like a more attractive way of going about this. So lots of criminologists are pretty skeptical that rational choice theory will explain crime, in part because there's some baseline skepticism of rational choice theory. We're not fully informed rational maximizers, right? We're not Homo economicus. Okay, whatever.
Speak for yourself.
So right. There is some dispute, though, about whether even violent crime is responsive to sort of pricing the crime along these kind of rational choice theory ways. And so there is evidence pointing in both directions, right? There are some meta-analyses, one somewhat recently done by Aaron Chalfin and colleagues, which does find that there is some effect, some evidence for violent crime consistent with the rational choice theory, right? But there are others, particularly the behavioral economists, who want to say things like, even if rational choice theory can explain some crime, it can only explain the crimes in which people are acting rationally. And it really seems like violent crime is the case where we're not acting rationally, right? This is what it is to say it's a crime of passion rather than a strategic crime. So what some behavioral economists think that we need to do about this is figure out a way to interrupt the violence. And they say, look, if you interrupt violence, it usually goes away. They don't come back later. Further evidence that this isn't rational, right? So one way that you could try to interrupt violence is by having lots of patrol officers around and like keeping an eye on things and making sure they don't get out of hand. An abolitionist proposal is to have community-based violence interrupters. Now, in my view, the community-based violence interrupters are just cops. They're, going around the community, collecting information and looking out for potential sources of violence. And then they're intervening and they're saying, you are not allowed to behave this way. This is just a kind of policing. So I should say that like my response to the abolitionists is not always that we need like the literal professional police department that we currently have to do this stuff, but that your agency that you're going to want to respond to this is going to be engaged in policing. And probably you want it to be a little bit professionalized because you want to make sure that the violence interrupters that you're hiring are, actually interested in interrupting violence and that they're skilled at it, right? Okay, so like I'm really broadly sympathetic to these kinds of claims that you're not going to get rid of violence by increasing wealth transfers. You're going to have to do things like change the learning environment that people are in, change the informal norms. You could add guardians, right? So, like, there are certain bars that are more likely to have fights than others. And so it seems like not a bad idea if you know there's likely to be a fight at this bar when it closes to like have a patrol officer there at like 2 a.m. or, whatever. But this is just a way of like interrupting the violence. Sometimes we want professional police departments to do that. Sometimes maybe we want someone else to do that, right?
Yeah.
And this is all with the kind of like Patrick Sharkey stuff, which suggests that community-based organizations are effective ways to reduce crime. Like these are just ways of changing norms. These are ways of adding guardians, removing offenders, so on.
Yes. The Sharkey stuff is super interesting. And so he has this book on Easy Pieces, that that was for me the big eye-opening moment. Reading that book, I just did not realize how incredibly destructive violence was to communities. It really shattered my like complacency about the issue, and I also just realized that it's super unequally distributed.
Yeah.
In particular, like young Black men in the U.S. they're even more disproportionately likely to be victims of homicide than to be victims of police violence. As of a few years ago, the rates were 4.5 times more likely for police violence, at 6.5 times more likely for homicide in general. So that book, was a big kind of like intellectual granddaddy of like the 2020 era police abolition.
Yeah.
But I feel like Sharkey's also kind of like subtler in some ways than a lot of the rhetoric from that era. Like, um, if you look at like his interviews since then, what he actually does not recommend using the A word for abolish the police. Like he says, what you should do is try. His plan is like we need to find some kind of look, violence is so bad, and we're not 100% certain that the alternatives would work as well as policing. Like he thinks it's likely, but he understands statistics and probability and knows it's not 100% likely. So what he
Yeah.
says is find some like place that's got serious crime problems and they're sort of like looking for a real reset, and then get them to um, maybe raise some private money even or whatever it takes to then like fund two parallel systems. So you got policing, just in case, and then you've got the alternative to policing kind of initially working alongside. And if it turns out that the system is working even better with both, then you try rolling back the policing. Uh, uh, he kind of self-deprecatingly jokes that maybe he's not that good at politics because no one has nibbled on this. Um, but
I, I don't think that's entirely true. So, like, I think that Sharkey is thinking about this in the right kind of way. I think it's congenial with the more kind of measured and cautious proponents of abolition and a kind of unbundling and defunding. Um, but I think that there are just like natural, like there are cases of this sort of thing happening. So, like the mental health response teams that were really popular amongst abolitionists are one example of pulling off a police function. Now, you're not entirely eliminating the police here because in cases where someone who's having a mental health crisis is also armed with a gun, right, the mental health response team is not going to do that alone, right? They're going to have the assistance of the police. But in other contexts, so in like bigger cities, you have these things called business improvement districts. And they get, I think, like half of the businesses in a certain area to agree to fund it, and then all of the businesses have to. It's like one of these sort of like gray areas of like a private group and a kind of local government. But okay, so what do these business improvement districts do? Well, they'll plant trees and they'll power wash sidewalks and they'll, pick up garbage. But they also have people, like I mentioned earlier, riding around on bikes and like, matching colored polos. Um, and they're engaged in a kind of policing. So if
mm,
the business improvement district guy is there, and you know that if you do something really bad, he'll either intervene or he'll call the cops, right? There is a guardian there. Now, the guardian is not armed with a gun, not going to arrest you and throw you directly in jail. And so, the way that I think about this is we get a nice kind of uncoupling of the policing and enforcement aspect from the burdens and the punishment aspect, right? And if you like walk around some coffee shops in downtown Los Angeles, you'll hear things like I overheard an employee at a cafe being trained, and the one employee said to the person being trained, if there's someone having a breakdown, don't call the cops, call the blue shirts. The blue shirts are the business improvement district, right? Like they're better at handling this than the LAPD is. If things get really out of hand, the LAPD can intervene or whatever. But I think that this provides evidence that in a lot of cases, having a kind of low touch uh, guardian of some sort that's like a step removed from the actual police department can do a lot of the policing work that we want. So it could be business improvement districts, but like you also see evidence of crossing guards in Chicago measurably reducing the amount of crime on various routes for public school children to get to school. So it doesn't need to be the police to serve as a guardian, right? And so you can sort of uncouple them. Now, this isn't like entirely two separate tracts, but I think that this is pretty close to what a lot of the unbundling proponents have in mind. Now, there's just like a limit on how much you can do this because if your city's really small, you're just not going to be able to afford the business improvement district. So there's like, we can go back to Adam Smith, right? Specialization is limited by the extent of the market. we're not thinking directly about like a sort of ordinary market here. We're thinking about like a labor market for bureaucratic labor, right? But we can say the same thing. Your specialization is limited by the scope of the market here.
Yeah, totally. Um, and there's really interesting questions about what it would look like to have more blue shirts. I mean, to some extent, we're just going to find out. Like,
Yeah.
as you know, there are currently more private security in the U.S. than cops.
Yeah.
Like, it's a truly astonishing stat, and we know very little in a systematic way about how they operate. To my knowledge, some of the only really great studies that we have so far are coming from, I mentioned him earlier, Ben Grunwald at Duke, and co-authors. And Ben told me that like it's really state to state whether they even have decent data about like who are the security officers,
Yeah.
what's it, what training do they need to have, where did they come from, where did they go, um,
And I
and
bet
before.
Universal is not keen on giving you that data, right?
No, no, no. They have an interest in keeping it. So actually, the only reason why Florida has got really good data on private security for researchers is that there's a law requiring them to have it. I
Mm,
mean, this is actually a super underrated thing that, like, often really good progress in policing comes because of a very far-sighted legal push. So, like, you know this case, but in the late 1990s, in North Carolina, there was a push to have better data collection on traffic stops because a lot of black people in North Carolina felt, but they were not believed, that there was like a bias in enforcement. And there were real debates in the legislature about this, and particular black like representatives made like impassioned pleas to their colleagues saying like, this has happened to me.
yeah.
And, this was a slightly less polarized time in our politics. And they were able to get a good coalition and actually pass a pretty great law requiring North Carolina to keep track of like, okay, not all the information, but like who's being arrested, what's the race of the person being arrested, uh, what happened after the arrest, or not the arrest, excuse me, the traffic stop,
Yeah.
because of course they don't all lead to arrests. And but what's funny is that this then led to like a bunch of nothing for years. So the data was just sitting there. And then a UNC professor named Frank Baumgartner just like heard from somebody that there was all this data that was being collected thanks to a law from like at this point, well, like I think well over a decade prior.
Yeah.
And then he ended up writing this, phenomenal book and working with like a lot of his career has been working with law enforcement around the state. So I mean, if you are out there somewhere and interested in yes, shout outs to Baumgartner at all. Like, it really like eye
Excellent.
opening book.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The like one of the big ideas is the veil of darkness, right? So like it turns out there's racial bias in stop rates during the day, and then at night it goes away. Like, well, what could possibly explain this? Well, the officers can't see the race of the driver at night, right? It's
Yeah,
pretty damning.
I mean, it's a pretty also incredibly clever bit of like empirical thinking.
It's like
Uh,
top social science in my view. I say this
uh,
as a philosopher, but like I think it's really good.
No, social science is often good. Actually, is a take that I have. I wanted to ask you a couple of things related to this. So first, there was something in the chat from Nathaniel, and second, I wanted to ask you about like how you see social science and philosophy. So just let me start with the question from Nathaniel. So I think this was about uh, you were distinguishing rational choice theory, which is like the kind of standard model in a lot of economic theories of behavior. People are trying to get more of what they want. Um, they're taking the means to do so, versus routine activities theory in criminology, right? Where there's no guardian, there's an opportunity. I forget the third component.
No guard, target, and offender.
Target and defender. Well, it seems like basically there just has to be no guardian because I mean, obviously there's going to be a target and an defender. But anyway, it's been a while since I read the main papers here. But um, Nathaniel asks, isn't that just like rational choice theory with more steps? because if there's a guardian, presumably the effect of the guardian is the likelihood of apprehension goes up. And then if you're rational, you don't want to get apprehended. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting question. What
Yeah.
do you think of that?
So I think that's largely right. I mean, you can imagine a criminologist saying, well, look, the thing that I'm denying is that the decision of the offender to go after the target is rational. And if it's not rational, then like, I mean, importantly, one of the things that you get to say here, if you like the rational choice theory, is that you can trade off likelihood of apprehension with severity of punishment because we're just doing some math here. And if you like routine activities theory, but you don't like rational choice theory, then you can retain routine activities theory while also denying this kind of rational choice upshot. Um, but yeah, I like the social scientists, the criminologists who reject rational choice theory, like kind of do so at their own risk in a certain sense, because like you don't have to be perfectly rational in order for you to react to incentives. And like clearly part of the picture in the routine activities theory is a reaction to the incentives, right? And
Right.
it's like whether it's like the likelihood that you'll be apprehended, or it could be something more informal, right? Like you're not gonna, I don't know, go into the trash can on the corner because someone's watching you and you're like a little embarrassed to do that or something, right? Like it doesn't have to be a fear of like legal punishment that's doing it.
Right.
And that
And,
has to be the case given the results we see from the crossing guards in Chicago. The crossing guards in Chicago are not arresting you, and yet people do their crime elsewhere, right?
right. Right. Um, no, that sounds right. I, I can't help but mention I've been reading Robert Axelrod's The Complexity of Cooperation, which is his follow up to the like all time classic and evolutionary game theory, Evolution of Cooperation. And he gets a little philosophical in the beginning. He says, why do we use game theory to study human behavior? Where game theory is kind of like rational choice theory with friends, where there's like, multiple people trying to get points more of what they want for themselves.
Yeah.
And he says, actually, the assumption of rationality is way less important in explaining why game theory is good than you
Hmm.
might think. He says it's like way more important that it just allows us to use logical deduction
Yeah.
to study human behavior. He's a bit unusual in that he uses other formal frameworks too. Some actually like drawn from physics, like how do uh, and like thinking about how like heat or whatever will propagate through a substance.
Mhm.
You know, similarly, like ideas or norms or behaviors might propagate. So, like for him, the kind of like it's not like some fundamental assumption about human nature that's like you then turn the logic crank and derive everything from that all critical assumption. It's more like, well, you just need some close enough assumption so that you can like really study what's going on here rather than swapping hunches about what's going on here.
Yeah.
Um, but I throw that out there because it's kind of striking and a little heterodox. And now I want to ask you the first non-policing question of the hour and 25-minute talk. So you, I'm hugely impressed by how much social science you clearly know and care about, and um, also by like the breadth of your philosophical knowledge. How do you see these two things as fitting together? Like, is it that social science tells us what consequences this policy will have, um, and then philosophy does all the ethics? Or do you think that they're sort of intertwined in some more like inextricable way? Like, how do you see social science and political philosophy as being related?
Yeah, I think they're really importantly related. So, like, I think of my work as falling within the PPE category. I think you mentioned this. So, there's like the obvious way that social science matters, right? If you've got some principle, some normative principle, and you want to figure out like whether it applies in some situation, right? You've got to like figure out like what's going to happen as a result of instituting some policy, right? Like what's going to happen if we raise the minimum wage, you know? You think you've got like a commitment to it's good for people to be paid more and it's bad for people to be like forced out of work, and the minimum wage literature tells you, well, some people get paid more, but also it looks like in some cases, some people get forced out of work. And, okay, so you can evaluate that. But more likely, what this is going to point out is that your normative theorizing is maybe a little bit underdeveloped, right? Because I mean, I don't know the minimum wage literature all that well, but to just stick with the example, it's likely that even if it doesn't have a disemployment effect, which some people find that it does, it will change the composition of the workforce. And so if I have to pay you $15 an hour, I'm more likely to pay an older person who requires less training than I am to hire someone for their first job. Because if it's their first job, I'm worried about their work ethic. I'm worried about whether they're going to make it on time, right? Like, I've been hearing things on Reddit and other places about the Gen Z stare. Have you heard about this? This place
I've just heard the name.
where they just stare at you with like mouth agape or something like that, like Larry and the Big Lebowski. I don't know whether this is true or not, but like this might be the sort of thing that I worry about. And so it changes who I hire. And if you're a moral philosopher or a political philosopher, you might think like, oh, I've got like a rough and ready response to this. I've got a way of thinking about the distributional effects. But I think it's pretty likely that in this sort of case, you're not going to have something rough and ready to say. And so you're going to have to do a little bit more theorizing because there are like patterns of kind of social change that the social sciences turn up that like induce you to do a kind of theorizing. Um, More generally, like in my work, I think of things from a non-ideal perspective. So you might ask, like, what does the ideal society look like? And as part of that project, you imagine that people are morally perfect or they're at least disposed to cooperate and, so on and so forth. This is, something like the Rawlsian project. But there are lots of really interesting questions. Like one that I'm particularly interested in is like how should cities manage their like tent encampments or their skid rows? What should Los Angeles do about Skid Row? What should San Francisco do about the Tenderloin? There's a kind of ideal theory project where you're like, this doesn't even come up because in my ideal world, right, there's material equality, no one's homeless, so on and so forth. But like, look, there's just a really important question that we in fact have to answer. What do we do about this sort of thing, right? What's the right way for cities to respond? And so when you're thinking about these kinds of questions, like you just like you need the social scientists to sort of get you up and running, right? Like you need the ethnographers to tell you like this is what it looks like from the perspective of the president of like a nonprofit development corporation or to be a police officer in a cruiser. So like I think of them as like pretty tightly linked and not purely in a philosophy tells you broadly what to do and then social science works out the details, but in a kind of like reciprocal give and take. Yeah.
Yeah. I I love that answer. It reminds me of something the political theorist Ian Shapiro says. Like he's a big believer in like problem-based political theory, where the problem is not like a kind of a priori thing, but something that gets maybe thrown up by the activity of politics or by, as you put it, like the perspectives of the people involved. Um, and like once you kind of hear this distinction for the first time, like theory based versus problem based, it becomes really fun to like sort a lot of the classic political philosophy.
Yeah.
Like, Hobbes, I think, is kind of in a way problem based.
I think so.
Yeah, where it's like everybody around here is killing everybody around here. Um, what do we do? And then versus, I think like Rawls. I hear that Rawls was very influenced by the civil rights movement and the war in Vietnam and so on. Um, but it's very, I mean, other than the section of theory of justice on civil disobedience, like it's extraordinarily theory based. Like it feels way more like he's annoyed by W.D. Ross
Yeah.
than anything else, by the intuitionists, and he wants to show that you can give a principle. Um,
Yeah, I mean, and even the civil disobedience stuff is pretty like abstract and theory driven. And I think at this point, like the bulk of the contemporary work on protests and on disobedience is like a negative reaction to the way that Rawls wanted to carve things up.
So speaking of negative reactions to roles, I actually have a question for you from Theophilus, who said, "I haven't been able to read Jake's book, but I assume he talks about this in detail. How does non-ideal theorizing fit with police discretion?" So I'm interested in your answer to that question, and maybe you can also talk about non-ideal versus ideal theory more generally, if you'd like to.
Yeah, so the non-ideal ideal theory distinction is basically downstream of Rawls, but it's kind of been broadened since. So one way of thinking about the project of ideal theory is to try to think about like the best, most just version of our political and social institutions. And a lot of people think that in order to do that, you want to idealize other aspects of the model society that you're reasoning about. So you could idealize the character of the agents in the model. You could idealize the kind of material environment and imagine that there's no scarcity. You could idealize the like ideological perspectives of everyone involved. You could imagine that we're all like liberals talking to other liberals. This is roughly like the Rawlsian project, because the non-liberals end up being unreasonable if I have that right.
That really helps liberal political philosophy.
It's really useful. It makes the job of the theorist much easier. Uh, Non-ideal theory is, a reaction to this. And you're saying, well, if you engage in these various idealizations, you're sort of changing the subject, right? You might be able to idealize away friction in the context of some like engineering project where you're applying a theorem or something. But if you ignore or idealize away the fact that there's material scarcity, or if you idealize away the fact that we have deep political and moral disagreements, you're sort of like not doing the project of political philosophy anymore. That's like a really kind of short gloss on the debate. There's a lot more that goes into it, but that sort of, I think, gives a useful characterization. Now, the ideal theorists get to ignore the social sciences, right? And like, I think that they're often sort of upfront about this. So, like, I take it that David Estlin, for instance, thinks that his justification of his democratic framework, and like his work in utopophobia, like this all succeeds even if you can come up with some social science informed like critiques, right? The theory of justice is somehow like fact insensitive. You find this in like G.A. Cohen and other people too. But I just think that like on the one hand, doing non-ideal theory blocks certain questions that are interesting. And so the kind of people who are interested in problem-based political philosophy, to use that distinction, are going to be non-ideal theorists, right? Because the problem is indication that things are not going ideally well, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so in the context of policing, right, there's like one question about, well, do we need police? Are the problems that we assign to the police the sort of things that we can reasonably idealize away or not? And I think that like though some ideal theorists think we can imagine the stuff away, I think that that's problematic. I think it's really important to ask these questions about like how police ought to be operating. There's another way of idealizing, though. So, like the political philosophers who historically have talked about policing end up saying things like, well, the police should, faithfully enforce the law. And that puts like all of the action here on the legislative side of things. And of course, it's really important that we have like a well functioning legislature and an effective criminal code. Turns out legislatures are really bad at drawing up criminal codes, which is why the model penal code exists, right? It's really difficult. So, in a certain sense, it's like a little odd, I think, to take up a question about policing by imagining that the laws are all good, right? We shouldn't do that, right? So, like, one important version of non ideal theory here is like, what should the police do given the fact that there are certain laws that we don't want them to enforce? Once again, right? Yeah, you're just now on the hook for a theory of police discretion, I think.
Something kind of interesting about this, just to circle back to the police abolition discussion from earlier, one of the very attractive things that the police abolitionists say is that we can have a better world. Like part of why we think we need police is that we have not fixed certain social problems that are fixable, and we're sort of, even if we reform the police, they say we'd be like just basically procrastinating on the really important thing, which is ending whether it's capitalism or whatever the system is that's causing all the problems. Um, but it's funny because a lot of the attack on ideal theory, I feel like, has similar vibes in philosophy to a lot of the skepticism about policing. But
Yeah.
there's one of the that's one of the most striking ideal theory arguments that I've kind of heard about. That we should be idealizing away from some of the problems that we've got that are creating crimes. Um, yeah, I've never known quite what to make of that tension, but I'm very intrigued by that argument.
Yeah, I mean, so I say a little bit about this in just policing. My maybe kind of cynical interpretation is that a lot of the abolitionists just don't understand the ideal theory literature or the distinction between ideal theory and non-ideal theory. And this isn't surprising, right? Like Alex Vitale's a sociologist, so it would be a little weird if he were like fully versed in the intricacies of like post-Rawlsian political philosophy. Um,
As
at the
everybody should be.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
perfect. Yeah.
I mean, at the same time, though, like I think that a lot of abolitionist arguments are making kind of bad ideal theory type arguments, right? So, like one way that you can appeal to ideal theory and policy discussions is to say that, uh, you know, it like ideally we wouldn't. Uh, Ideally, the police would enforce the law fully, right? Because in the ideal circumstances, all of the laws are just, and presumably in the ideal world, all of the punishment standards are also just. And so there's no risk of enforcing an unjust law, and there's no risk of, too much punishment. But like, and in fact, like I interpret some people like Joseph Raz as making this kind of argument, right? Like if we are doing the ideal theory, then what the police ought to do is just sort of enforce the laws fully. And ideal theory is supposed to give us a map from like where we are to where we want to go. And so, okay, look, ideal theory tells us this is how police should behave, and now right we're going to apply this on the world that we live in. But if you apply a full enforcement ideal to the police in our non-ideal world, you're going to get really really awful policing because there are unjust laws and there are unjust punishments, right? So I think that in some cases, we can be doing ideal theory where we're imagining a potential future that we want to experiment and work towards. In which case, you're not really an abolitionist. You're saying it would be nice if we could reduce our reliance on policing and come up with non police alternatives. And of course, like, liberals think this too. On the other hand, I think that you could be like misapplying ideals generated from ideal theory to the actual policy circumstances we find ourselves in now.
Can I have you for 5 more minutes? Or is
Yeah.
your phone about to? Oh, fantastic. Okay, okay, great, great. I got an example of this.
Actually, I can't leave my office for a little while. There is a film crew here at Mud Hall, and like they're really mad that I'm in my office right now. Like I don't know what to tell them, but like I walked into my office and there was like a really wide-eyed PA, and I just nodded and kept going. Came into my office, grabbed my coffee cup, went to the main office to get some coffee, and on my way back in, he's like, "We're filming," and I'm like, "Well, my office is in there. I don't know what you want. I won't go in and out much, so I can stay."
We're filming. Come on. Like
What? Okay, what we have here is a nuisance conflict, right?
That's right. That's right. This is we're seeing liberalism being rebirthed before our very eyes. This okay. So I, there's this there was a violence prevention nonprofit in Durham, which is part of the research triangle that Chapel Hill belongs to. Durham, Raleigh, Chapel Hill, called Bull City United. And Bull City United had a budget of just over 2.5 million a year, about half of which came from Durham City Council. And they would basically try to have non-police violence interrupters that would go, and many of them had some background in gangs. So they, had maybe gone to jail or had some experience with this, and they wanted to kind of go back and like stop the cycle and so on. And this sounds like amazing. And you can see like, if you're thinking ideal theoretically, like this is great. What could go wrong? Well, literal answer to the question. I mean, there's no guarantee that it's going to go wrong, and it would be amazing if it does go great. But uh, I think as the an interim mayor said, like perhaps we should have done more vetting. So it turns out that several of them were actually like selling crack cocaine, and one person in particular was arrested for selling crack cocaine. Some of them were somebody else was arrested on gun charges. So like, it turns out that if you're like being paid money and you have former connections to organized crime, like it's not impossible that you'll use that money to do crime. You hope this doesn't happen, but like there's no guarantee that it won't happen. So anyway, this program got shut down last November, and it was just a kind of a real tragic tale of like, look, programs that might sound good in theory could end up like sending people back into lives of crime,
Yeah.
which is not helping anyone. And it's also taking money away that could have been spent on like all kinds of really good programs. And I mean, to their credit, Durham shut it down. Uh, but it's just, the headlines wrote themselves.
Yeah. There's another version of this in Baltimore. This is maybe the most dramatic example that I know of, where one of the violence interrupters ended up murdering someone. And like, this is not unrelated, though, to the problems of actual professional law enforcement. So, also in Baltimore, pretty famously, you had the Gun Trace Task Force. So, we talked about The Wire. If you want another David Simon show, you can watch the miniseries We Own the City. It's not nearly as good as The Wire. David Simon is clearly annoyed that he's been making the same anti drug war argument for what, like 30 years now. And so he's like, I'm literally going to create a character who just speaks my view at you. But it's still worth watching. Anyway.
Yeah.
Uh,
I cringed audibly during that entire scene, though. I was
yeah.
like, this is the David Simon self-insert phase.
Yes.
But yes, sorry,
It's
please
not
continue.
it's not great. It's still worth watching, right? What
Oh, yeah,
you
yeah, yeah, yeah.
learned from this is that the thing that makes someone really good at getting illegal guns off the street is knowing the social network where you're likely to find the illegal guns. And when you know that social network, you're plugged into it in a sense, and so you have opportunities. And so like the Gun Trace Task Force was stealing drugs and then reselling them, right? And part of the reason why they were able to do that is because, like these violence interrupters, they're like plugged into the network. Now, you can plug yourself into the network by being like a good undercover cop, or you can come from the network, because you were in it earlier. But in either case, right, you're going to have the possibility that the enforcer behaves badly, right? They take advantage of opportunities, in a sort of rational, self-interested kind of way, or someone disrespects them and they get emotional, and end up resorting to police brutality, or if we're talking about a violence interrupter, that sort of thing. Like, one of the kind of main takeaways that I want people to take from my work on policing is that any of the alternatives, even if they're abolitionist alternatives, are really likely to raise the same kinds of questions that we have about our current police department, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And something I like about it is that it's not like a totally asymmetric attempt to like dunk on something. Like, you're not saying that one type of program is categorically like worthless and one type of program is noble and just. I mean, in a way, you're I think the most cynical. Like you're saying that social control is a durable problem, and um, getting rid of the building where people wear blue shirts and there's sergeants and captains and so on. Just renaming that wouldn't eliminate the kind of fundamental problem that, like, if people are plugged, as you said, put it, people are plugged into criminal networks, um, they're going to be tempted.
Yeah.
And if people are given discretionary power, as they must, given the enforcement dilemma you lay out, there's potential for abuse.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that all sounds. I'm just kind of echoing you now at this point there, but I really like that. That's something I really took away from your work on this. Can I ask you just some like general questions, but feel free if there's something we haven't covered yet you want to get to. Now is a good time.
No, I think we talked about all the stuff that I'm interested in. Yeah. I don't know. We could go off on like weird examples of policing, like the Central Park Keepers or like the beach cops here, but I think we've talked enough about that.
Okay, okay. I'm always down for weird examples, but I wanted to ask you, like, do you feel like political philosophy is in a good place right now? And if so, like, what's some stuff that you're excited about? Not necessarily your own, but also don't be shy if it's your own.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really cool work going on in political philosophy. There's just like a ton of money sloshing around for people who are interested in broadly PPE style work. And I think that's great because I think the PPE style work is more likely to be non-ideal oriented, problem oriented. It's more likely to take on board some tools that we get from other disciplines. And like, you know, I'm a philosopher. I think the philosophers are the best, but like, there's lots of cool work happening in the social sciences, lots of cool frameworks. You know, I like it's striking. I think that when we're thinking about the extent to which we can unbundle the police, I am tempted to just like go back to Adam Smith and start talking about the like kind of day one, like most basic facts in economic theory about like the relationship between markets and special opportunities for specialization. So I think that there's like a lot of really cool work that is methodologically like I think superior to a lot of the stuff that happened in like the immediate reaction to Rawls. I'm particularly excited about the kind of like burgeoning philosophy of the city. So there have been people who have been working on the philosophy of the city for a little while, but like it seems like there's a kind of renewed interest, kind of buzz around it. So you've got a lot of people thinking about problems of like segregation and integration and gentrification, right? These are important things. As a like result of this kind of interest, one of the things that you're seeing is people are taking our theories of territorial sovereignty at the national level. So you think about like debates over immigration and border control and this sort of thing, and like jurisdictional rights, and they're applying this to questions about like the places that we find in cities, right? So you might think that like your kind of nationalist defense of territorial sovereignty is going to reproduce at like a level and like privilege a local community, you know, over newcomers or something, and this is supposed to be relevant for thinking about urban policy. There's a bunch of work in this area happening right now, and I think that that's all really interesting and exciting. I think that like you'll get some cross pollination where some cool stuff will be happening and thinking about the city, and then probably it will lead people to revisit some of their ideas about the nation state. So that's the kind of thing that I'm really excited about right now.
Yeah, I love this focus on the city. Um, and I also I want to shout out the political epistemology kind of literature that's burgeoning. I think it's really cool that um, you know, like Michael Hannon and Elise Woodard, and there's also some stuff in like applied epistemology, like thinking about you know, problems in our not just like not just the kind of basic like people are irrational. There's a lot of people. Now we have a lot of irrationality, but like you know how we think about voting, how like bad theories can spread through a population,
Yeah,
and the epistemic whole can be worse than the sum of the epistemic parts.
yeah.
Yeah, I find that stuff kind of interesting as well.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I like a lot of the contemporary work on democratic theory. Not in the sense that I think I'm usually convinced by it, but in the sense that I find it really interesting. So you're getting like the kind of confluence of like social and applied epistemology and democratic theory, and I think that's really good if we're thinking about like the reliability of procedures, right? I think this is important work. But there's also a really kind of pronounced push to get democratic theory to move beyond thinking about like direct electoral relationships. And so in this way, you know, we're like maybe 10, maybe 20 years behind like the political scientists. But there's just a lot of work on non-electoral democracy that like, you know, given the things that I say about police discretion, like I'm clearly influenced by, right? These are supposed to be non-electoral ways of securing a kind of democratic legitimacy. I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening there.
Can I ask you about this? So this was something that um, I didn't talk about in my review of your book because I don't have the same background in democratic theory. Um, but I was struck by it. So you know, the natural way of thinking about democratic accountability and democratic processes is like the election is the enforcer, right? We pick you. Maybe that expresses the will of the people, um, which you know is not, as you know, is a problematic notion in some ways, given arrows and possibility theorem. But the thought is, elections are how the people make their voice heard. And you're saying that there's some kind of accountability that's not that. Um, why do you hate elections so much?
And
And no,
I think
talk me
that
through it.
elections are important, right? But they are often pretty crude. because they're usually first past the post majoritarian decision making tools. And particularly when it comes to things like policing, I think that our political, like our jurisdictional boundaries, lack the kind of sensitivity that we need. So, like, you know, Angelinos elect council members, but the council member ends up serving a really big district that might include Skid Row and like the part of downtown that I live in or something. And the way that you want governance, like agents of the state, people who work for the city, acting and like in front of like crypto.com arena is different from what you want them to be doing in Skid Row. And so I worry that elections as we normally have them lack um, the ability to be sufficiently fine grained, both in terms of territory, but also in terms of the groups. So if you're, a member of a minority, it's pretty easy for you to end up as a persistent minority. Now, like, I don't know if there's a solution to this in like broader electoral democratic theory, but like one way of thinking about how certain arrangements secure more democratic legitimacy than others is by thinking not just about accountability relationships, but thinking about representative relationships. And so there's a way to enhance the democracy, the democratic credentials of a jurisdiction by making the unelected bureaucrats more concerned with representation, right? So, like, I use the buprenorphine example in Burlington, Vermont, to make this point. So, you brought it up earlier. Won't go through all the details, but the idea is just that the ban on buprenorphine, which is a little bit like methadone, contributes to this public health crisis. There's no reason for the police to be further contributing to the public health crisis, so they announced that they're not going to enforce the laws against buprenorphine possession anymore. And what happened was, like a year and a half later or something, the legislature followed suit and updated the law. And so you could have like a really basic kind of electoral approach to thinking about democracy where this is all a problem. Or if you've got like a kind of problem oriented approach and you're curious about what democratic governance at like the urban or municipal level looks like, well, here's an example of something that strikes me as like a win, a success story for democracy, but doesn't follow the kind of neat accountability relationship that certain basic theories might have, right? Instead, what you see is a police department exercising their power in a way that they want to make it more representative, turning up some good results, and then the legislature following suit. And that seems all like relatively democratically like above board to me. But it requires a fuller theory of democratic legitimacy and sources of democratic legitimacy.
The example speaks a thousand words there. I like that a lot. Um, Now we get into the real hard hitting questions. Um, I'm told you like tiki bars.
I do like
Uh,
TRs.
what do you like about tiki bars? This is the what the people want to know about Jake Monaghan.
Okay. Basically, almost everything about tiki bars is good. Okay, so you walk into a tiki bar, and it's going to be unlike any other place that you've been. There's going to be glass buoys hanging from the ceiling, and there are going to be like carved faces on the wall, and bamboo and jade tiles, and it's going to be like dark, and there's probably going to be a water feature or whatever, right? And you're like, what have you been doing all day? You've been reading news stories about how like the Trump administration is like deliberately harassing brown people in order to get them to self-deport, and he's firing the head of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics or whatever, right? He's just doing all these terrible things, shouting at reporters from like the rooftop of the White House that he's ruining. You need to escape, right? The tiki bar is an escape. So you can go in and not talk about any of this other bullshit. But then, right, the most important thing is you get to drink usually amazing cocktails. So the cocktails are basically all rum based, and I really like rum. And if you go to the right tiki bars, you will get like, a recipe that's like 100 years old, made, really lovingly and up to specs. And so, yeah, if you're really into cocktails, if you like craft cocktails, you should find yourself a good tiki bar because it's a way for like craft bartenders to kind of like flex a little bit.
I didn't even think about that. Is there something else that you really like that maybe people don't know that you really like?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, So yeah, what else do I like besides tiki bars and rum? I'm really into the Buffalo Bills. Big fan of the Buffalo Bills.
Nice,
Josh Allen
nice.
is awesome.
Like everybody else in Los Angeles. Yeah.
No, so for a while I was going to see Chargers games with a friend, and the Chargers have basically no fans anymore because the league, moved them from San Diego, or they moved from San Diego to LA, and lost a lot of their fans. And so it's striking to see, like the Chargers fans are kind of boring and not that into it, right? They're like just people from LA who are like hanging out at SoFi Stadium for the afternoon. Whereas, you hang out in Buffalo or you go to the Bills Stadium and they're just absolute like crazy, super into the Bills, diving through folding tables, like donating money for fun, like a player on the other team gets injured and so everyone donates like his jersey number. He's number 45. Everyone donates $45 to like his charity or something. Like the Bills are just the best. It just doesn't get better.
That's amazing. We have a chat question related to tiki bars. There is no way we're not going to take this. What about a tiki bar with lots of gilding? Asks Meg.
What do you mean by gilding?
N- maybe tiki bars are like golden. I think of them as mostly like bamboo or not like bamboo, but you know what I mean. Like
Yeah, they're mostly kind of dark and earth tony. I mean, so I will say there are lots of tiki bars that are really bad. So I don't want to mislead people into thinking that like all tiki bars are good. In fact, probably most of them are pretty crappy because most of the drinks are bad, right? So you'll walk into a place that's got like really nice decor and then the drinks are crappy, This is a common thing.
we have a clarification.
Clarification.
It's Trump style gold stuff.
I don't know if I've ever been into a tiki bar that has Trump style gold stuff. If I saw it, I would probably leave promptly. That would be a
May-
bad
may-
sign.
Maybe there's Tiki Trump Tower or something. Uh,
So there
but
is actually a relationship between Trump and Tiki, which is sort of funny. He bought a building in New York and put in the Trump Hotel. And in the basement of this hotel, which was actually really common for a long time, was like a really large, elaborate tiki bar. I think it was a Trader Vic's. Now, there are only two Trader Vic's left in the US. There's one in Atlanta and one in Oakland. I think it was a Trader Vic's. And Trump said that the Trader Vic's is tacky and we need to get rid of it. And like, this is just the most mind blowing thing ever, right? Like, Trump is not allowed to make this sort of complaint. But if you ask some, tiki fiends or tiki heads, they will blame Trump for the fact that like most tiki bars in New York City haven't been successful. Like, people will open them and they'll last for a couple of years and go out of business. So there is some reason to believe that Trump has cursed tiki in New York City.
you heard it first here. The depths of the tiki lore are go even further than I expected. I got one last question for you, Jake. No, I have two last questions for you. Okay, because while you're trapped, might as well take advantage. Uh, First is like, how serious do you think the kind of loss of community is? So this is just a PPE question that I'm getting kind of interested in. Like, there's this Robert Putnam bowling alone type stuff. Um, you and I are on a group chat with a few friends, and I feel like that is major social capital in my life. And I wonder how you see the kind of loss of social capital problem. And is the solution for people to go to Buffalo Bills games? Is the solution for there to be more group chats, more meetups at the Tiki Bar? Is this a feature in your either your work or just your life or your takes?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, so first of all, yes, more group chats, more meetups at the Tiki Bar. I welcome everyone to renounce their fandom and become a fan of the Buffalo Bills. Like, I'll teach you what you need to know. Big tent here. Um, I mean, I'm inclined to think that a lot of the kind of problems of isolation are technological. Like, I think I just probably buy the like Noah Smith argument that it's just really convenient to like scroll your phone and stay home and watch Netflix or whatever. But I think that there's like a really obvious kind of backlash to that, and so I'm optimistic that we will figure out how to incorporate technology into our lives in such a way where it doesn't just kind of ruin us and we're not just scrolling. Um, I think that this is important from the perspective of liberal theory because a lot of critics of liberalism will take the kind of methodological individualism that liberals employ, where like what matters for, say, justification is whether, you kind of consent to the relationship, whether like the terms of the relationship are voluntary. Um, and they'll look at that methodological individualism and they'll see in liberalism like a commitment to a kind of atomistic society. And I think this is like exactly the wrong way to think about liberalism, right? Like the liberals, just as much as any other theorist, needs and values these communities, right? These groups. But what's, like I said, really important for the liberal, given the methodological commitments, is that the terms of the relationship are consensual, right? Like you we don't want to be like forcing people onto group chats just because they need to be on a group chat, right? We need people creating their group chats. We need people like coming up with like, all right, we're all going to hit the tiki bar on Thursday or whatever it is, or like we're going to get together and drink Labatt Blue on Sunday, and we're going to watch the Buffalo Bills, right? And the in-group out-group stuff ends up being really important here, but like the nice thing about everyone being a Bills fan is that like the out-group for Bills fans is like, okay, we make fun of the Patriots, we make fun of the Jets or whatever. Really importantly, we make fun of people for dipping their chicken wings in ranch dressing instead of blue cheese. Like it's really important for Buffalonians and therefore Bills fans that like you don't eat ranch, right? Now this is like really silly, but humans need the groups. And that means they need the in groups and the out groups. And I think it would be really nice if we weren't, fully giving in to like uniform polarization, and we like hung out on Saturday and watched football together and like tried to, recreate these kind of cross-cutting community things. Like, I'm not really saying anything original here. This is just like Tocqueville, Putnam, Mill kind of rolled into one, right?
No, I like that. It's a sort of Toke Mill Putnam burrito or something, you
Yes.
know, but not dipped in ranch.
No ranch, no ranch. Get out of here with the ranch.
I'm glad I've been warned. Not that I was going to, but now the actual final question. Um, I think that a lot of podcasters ask questions like, what are three books you'd recommend for the audience, or what's your favorite color? That you know, are not as interesting to me because, of course, everybody likes books and people can come up with three very pretentious books anytime they want. I want to know, what are some academic articles that you love? Because I think that peer-reviewed journal articles get a lot of hate, not completely undeservedly, but they need a little love to balance it out.
Yeah. All right. You put me on the spot here. Let me think.
Even just one, and it doesn't have to be the absolute favorite.
Yeah, one that I find myself citing pretty regularly is this article by Samuel Scheffler, and I think it was Philosophy and Public Affairs, called "Immigration and the Significance of Culture." It's a really great piece. Roughly, the argument is there are certain folks who think that like the interest in preserving your culture can justify closing your borders, or at least like significantly reducing mobility across your borders. And Scheffler points out that actually, like when you properly understand culture, you can't actually hold this view. And the reason is because um, even if you totally blocked off newcomers, you're still going to get changes in the culture. In part because the right way to understand culture is that there are varying levels of granularity for you to understand your culture at. So, like, you can think, this is one of his examples about like American Jews, or you can distinguish between like the Jews that live in LA and the Jews that live in New York City, right? Like there are going to be certain similarities, but there will be important differences, right? If you go to Langer's, the great Jewish deli here in LA, you're not going to find any black and white cookies, right? Just as like a kind of trivial example. But what that means is that like what is important culturally for you is often made salient by certain contrast classes, and you're just going to get shifts in the culture given that there isn't a sort of uniform, unified conception of culture. People will emphasize different things in different contexts, and you're just going to get some drift as a result, right? And so what that means is you can't actually preserve culture as it is by blocking mobility. And so maybe you think you've got some other reason to want to block mobility, but it really can't be for cultural preservation reasons. Now, I just think that this is like right at the level of the nation state, but I think that it's also important when we're thinking about local urban policy. So you've got like I think I don't know if this is like a developing sort of consensus, but a lot of people in philosophy and also in like critical urban studies will say things like we need to privilege the local group that lives here, right? If it's an ethnic enclave, we need to privilege the interests of that ethnicity. And one way that you can do this is by giving them local control. They'll exercise their veto right. They'll reduce the like flows in and out of the area. But like this isn't going to preserve the neighborhood as it is, right? And I think you can make kind of rinse and repeat at like the level of physical infrastructure as well. So like one of the most important things I think for political philosophy is thinking about how to handle not just diversity or disagreement, but also like the inevitable dynamism that comes along with that. So like this is maybe a kind of Nozikian way to put it, like liberty upsets patterns. This is true not just at the distributional level, but also in terms of residential patterns and all sorts of other things. Political philosophy needs to think about not just diversity, but dynamism is like extremely important, one of these sort of like core phenomena. And I think that the Scheffler paper makes that pretty clear.
Jake, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for talking. And thanks everybody for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
All right. I'll see you at the Tiki Bar.
Sounds good.